Fast, purposeful footsteps broke Zuko out of his meditation. Though the teen hadn't had a reason to smile in quite a while, the stern lines of his face lessened. Mealtime. There was no time-telling device in his cave. He couldn't even properly feel the sun anymore. But for a bunch of kids, the freedom fighters were surprisingly disciplined. They stuck to their schedule well. It had been long before his body grew accustomed to it. He folded out of his strict meditation pose and stood to face the door. His relaxed face tightened into a deep scowl when he saw who exactly was bringing his meal. Jet met his smile head-on as he unlocked the door. The Tantine slammed the door closed behind him and dropped the tray to the floor just inside the cell, far out of reach of Zuko's chain. "Heads up," the Earth Kingdom teen said, and that was all the warning he got before two wooden rods were thrown at Zuko's face. Well used to this treatment, the prisoner easily plucked them out of the air and had them up in a cross-blocking position just in time for one of Jet's swords to lock into the center of the X. His grip tightened on the rods, and he felt comfort in the familiar feeling of weapons in his hand. While sewing up a particularly bad gash on Zuko's arm during one of the earlier training sessions, Many-Man had insisted that they either use dulled weapons or make sure Zuko was armed. Jet wasn't a fan of using anything other than his swords. He made do back when Zuko was firebending, but ever since he'd stopped, Dowel still crossed and trapped Jet's right-handed blade. Zuko shot out a leg, getting the other team's middle. Jet was forced to jump back and disengage. He curved around, ensuring they stayed in the radius of Zuko's chain as they faced off. He had a lot of practice at it. Zuko took the offensive then, charging the other team with a furious flurry of attacks, some of which landed, but the majority were blocked or evaded. The team moved into a quick crouch and hooked Zuko's ankle with a crook of his sword, pulling the pale teen to the ground. Jet had improved a lot since they first started training. The firebender folded his hands above his head and used momentum to jump to his feet in a single move. So had Zuko. The first training session wasn't actually a bad memory, not based on his rather skewed metric at least. It had actually been something of a relief. For weeks after he first locked in the cave, nothing had happened. Many-Man had come to replace the bandages every other day. Someone would bring him food twice a day, and no one would tell him what they wanted from him. It had driven him crazy. He feared his days were numbered, that they were trying to ransom him and realized that they wouldn't get a single penny for a recently banished prince. Well, Uncle Iroh might have paid something, but they had already taken the money the man had snuck him. And Zuko doubted that word would ever get to the elder prince. He spent panicked days doing nothing but sitting in pain and wondering why they were keeping him alive and in relative comfort. After that, it had almost been a relief when Jet had barged in his cell with a sword drawn. As had become customary, Zuko had greeted the team with a blast of fire aimed at the small window of the cell. As it was not at all customary, Jet had grinned at the attack, saying, "Looks like you're eager for a fight. Get ready to prove it." The first fight had only lasted less than a minute, with Jet being pulled out through the door with his clothes smoldering. The rest of the freedom fighters had all taken a turn as well, but overall the entire first training session had lasted less than 5 minutes. 3 of that had been against Longshot because it was hard for him to reach the archer. Jet was much better now, unfortunately. Zuko managed to duck back as Jet took several swipes with his head and chest, dropping to attempt to sweep the older teen's legs out from under him. Jet smoothly jumped over to Zuko's kick and brought down one arm in a chopping motion that sent his sword to crash over Zuko's head. The Fire Nation teen brought up his clubs and another X-shaped block, and therefore there was no way to stop the other sword swiping straight to his unprotected side. Jet struck swiftly, strong and true, stopping a millimeter from slicing Zuko open to gently tap his side with the blade. Zuko grounded to acknowledge the blow that would have hit, and the two disengaged, taking a moment to slowly circle one another, blade in every hand, strangely warped mirrors of each other. Jet had only had one sword when they met years ago. He used it as well as an untrained and desperate 14-year-old operating on talent alone could. Zuko somehow managed to disarm both him and Pipsqueak. The hook sword and Crudel were completely different sizes and weights. He was off balance and the grips didn't fit his hands well. Still, it was almost like having his dowel again, and something in him had eased. It was the first time he'd fought without using firebending at all, moving through the stances. Pideho had taught him with a fluidity and grace he had never felt when using his worse than his sister bending. He had looked as impressive as he felt, as Jet had shown up with the second blade not a week later. Zuko sometimes still mocked the Earth Kingdom kid for copying him. Less so now, since Jet actually knew how to use the things. The prince darted forward, ducking under Jet's offensive swings. An impressive show of flexibility, he shot out a leg while crouched and laid a kick flat against the other teen's chest. Simultaneously, he struck his club against the crook of Jet's curved blade, forcing the weapon from the teen's hand. Jet grunted as the blow sent him falling to the ground with only one blade. Zuko moved forward, attacking the fallen teen, but Jet managed to roll out the radius of his chain and kicked his sword far out of the firebender's reach. Zuko growled as he was brought short, reaching for the teen ineffectively. Who had never dared to come alone before. Every other training session, there had always been at least two others to protect him or subdue Zuko. This was his chance to... Well, he didn't necessarily want to kill the other teen. Not even, but he could take him hostage and threaten it. Or just refuse to give him back. He could do nothing, because now Jet was standing a few mere feet outside. Zuko snarled, an angry, animalistic thing as a potential chance of freedom mocked him from outside his reach. An infuriating smirk peeked out from behind that stalk of wheat, but Jet didn't move. In frustration, the banished prince violently threw the clubs at the other teen. Jet dodged the first, but the second nailed him hard in the ribs. Jet doubled over and the air was driven from his lungs, and Zuko leaned forward again, able to reach just far enough for his fingers to brush against the soft poof of the other boy's hair. He growled wordlessly in frustration as he got no closer than that, unable to get a grip on him. However, when Jet finally straightened, he looked even more frustrated than Zuko. Impressive feat, given the Fire Nation boy's well-known furious temper. "Why don't you just firebend?" The tan teen snarled. "I'm right here!" His shout rang and echoed in the spacious cavern. Zuko's heart beat furiously in his chest, even as he twisted his face to show contempt. He hoped to hide his terror. "I won't let you use me against my people. Not anymore." He repeated his common refrain, licking his lips. Zuko tried to turn the conversation away from bending. He wasn't optimistic. Jet often had a one-track mind. Unfortunately, the team was very good at finding new and unusual ways to stay on the track. "What? Water Tribe peasant not working out like you thought?" Zuko taunted. "You finally meet someone who won't kiss the ground you walk on, and suddenly you can't manipulate him like you want to. Fancy that." Jet snarled at him, looking seconds away from starting round 2. "The situation is more complicated than you could know, Firebender. But I promise you, Sokka's corporation isn't the issue. He's not about to have a change of heart and suddenly show up to free you." "I didn't think he would," Zuko snapped honestly. He knew that life didn't work out like that. Not for him. He was lucky to be born and hasn't had a single iota of luck since. "In fact," Jet smirked. "In fact, I don't even need to waste one more of my freedom fires watching you. Not when I have other plans that I could be working on while you sit here refusing to bend." Jet smirked and started to walk out of the room. He reached the door and Zuko started, chain rattling as he held out a hand. "Hey, wait, you! You can expect a brand new guard tomorrow, Firebender. I'll tell you to behave, but I think I'll save my breath." "Wait, you forgot—" The metal door clanged shut against the stone of the cave as Jet left, forgetting the food tray at the foot of the door, well out of Zuko's reach. Zuko scowled at the innocent-looking tray, the usual meal of rice, dried meat, and various fruits and veggies. His growl was mirrored by his stomach as he watched the platter, but no matter how much he glared, the tray did not magically grow legs and walk to him. With a huff, he moved back against the wall and sat, centering his breath until he was calm once more. It had never even occurred to him to hope the Water Tribe would free him. So he supposed that it was something that Jet didn't take away, some secretly kindling hope. No, his situation was just as hopeless as it had been last week, and the week before, the week before that, and the years before that. No one had come to look for him. His uncle had probably forgotten about him the week after he didn't show up at Kyoshi. His mother was gone, and his father never wanted him back. That had been a hard lesson to learn, and maybe one he never would have realized if he had anything to do for the last few years beyond sit in the dark and think. It had started with a simple thought, only a few months into his captivity. This never would have happened to Azula. Then it had shifted to, Father would have never banished Azula in the first place. His mind had meanly wanted to follow that line of thought, but he rejected it that first day. He had instead forced himself into a kata, despite his still functioning internal clock saying it was the middle of the night. A few nights later, the thoughts had returned and were joined by a question. Why would Father do this to me when he would never have done it to Azula? Those thoughts had festered in the back of his head. They were angry, desperate thoughts that he tried unsuccessfully to ignore. They kept coming back a few nights later, bitter and in pain after a particularly brutal training session. The thought had come unbidden. Father always preferred Azula anyway. I bet he's glad that she's got to be his heir now. He was always so proud of her. That thought had been poison, striking him with a fearsome blow that had been felt physically. Then, did Father banish me on purpose, so that Azula could inherit the title? Was that his plan all along? The thoughts had seemed ludicrous when he woke the next morning. Of course not. Father loved him. He had to banish Zuko after the cowardice and disrespect he'd shown. In his foolishness, Zuko had forced his father's reluctant hand. Ozai hadn't wanted to do any of this. Maybe he could convince himself of that. Maybe he could still believe that Father loved him, if only he had anything to do that would keep the thoughts that would return that night. And the next, and the next. Each night, the traitorous, hateful thoughts seemed stronger, and each morning, the palpitations' excuses seemed weaker. After all, it could have been well within Father's royal right to decree a quest banishment, a goal that Zuko could complete in order to return. In fact, it was customary for any banished nobility to be given to such quest as a chance to prove their loyalty and regain their honor. Zuko's royalty, the Fire Lord's own son, and Ozai couldn't even be bothered to make up something impossible for him to do. So the thoughts continued, and the excuses grew more quiet, until one morning he woke and found he accepted the accusations as true. Father didn't want his loyal son to return. Zuko had been disfigured and banished for a minuscule slight that could be construed into just enough of an insult that the Fire Lord could make sure his sister wore the crown. Zuko never expected to go home, even if he escaped. He nearly fried Sneers to a crisp that day. His anger and emotion fueled his flame like a beast. Now he clung to each day, just trying to survive until the next moment. Never sure if it would be his last. He just had to try to stay alive, to try to be enough value to the freedom fighters without harming his people in the process. They alone would be able to decide if he should live or die. Zuko felt like his sister's friend Ty Lee, walking on a razor-thin line and liable to fall if in any moment. The boy was broken from his thoughts when footsteps sounded from the other side of the door. He glanced up to see torchlight flickering through the small window. A moment later, Pipsqueak stood in the open doorway. The older teen nodded at Zuko and a smile, softly amused. Jet forgot about the food until it was halfway to the entrance, but he was too proud to come back. I wasn't supposed to tell you that, but... Zuko smirked and nodded to the clubs against the opposite wall. That was the rule. He had to return the weapons before he was allowed food. He denied himself too often uselessly in the past to bother now. It didn't hurt them for him to go hungry, just him. He liked to think he was still stubborn, but he'd also learned the delicate skill of give and take. Pipsqueak handed him the tray and moved to grab the clubs, dropping to sit cross-legged across from Zuko, at a distance safely outside of his range. Zuko eyed him wearily as Pipsqueak spoke. I feel like something's going on with Jet. I have for a while now, but recently his plans are getting, darker. His temper is short, he's more paranoid, and is showing off more. I'm really worried about him. Zuko rolled his eyes. Never felt more trapped than when the Freedom Fighters tried to talk to him about their problems. Or anything, really. Captive audience, indeed. He'd much rather Jet come back with the swords. Don't get me wrong, Pipsqueak said, as though Zuko had offered some sort of opinion. He hadn't. He tried to talk as little as possible during these kind of heart-to-hearts. He certainly didn't want to encourage them to happen more often. Jed's brilliant. He's done a lot for all of us. He helped so many kids, keeping them safe, giving them a home. His plans almost always work, and I know that protecting these kids is the right thing. I'm worried, but I still trust Judge impeccably. Surely. Why couldn't Pipsqueak have just wanted to beat him up? I don't, Zuko grumbled, tearing at a piece of dried meat. He hadn't really meant anything by that comment. It was true, of course, but it was just one of those bitter, grumpy thoughts that he voiced whenever he was forced to speak to one of Jet's little minions. However, for some reason, that made Pipsqueak pause. The larger boy eyed Zuko for something deep, unfathomable, and uncomfortable in his eyes. Something that Zuko had never seen in them before. No, I guess you wouldn't. Sokka threw his boomerang, watching it bend around the forest around him in expecting angles before thudding into the log of a tree. That particular tree had a myriad of similar boomerang wounds, and Sokka grinned at his success before moving to grab the weapon and reset. The repetitive action of practice lured him into a sense of ease and peace that had been lacking of late. Back home, he would spend hours training. There wasn't much time for it on the road, so he was getting some practice in while he could. Besides, he came up with his best plans when boomerang in hand. Sometimes he felt like there was a direct correlation between the weapon and his mind. Something about watching the blue and silver streak through the air exactly to where he wanted to go just freed his mind. He needed some good ideas right now. He felt like it should be simple. Kidnapping was wrong. Keeping someone as a prisoner and forcing them to fight was wrong. He should do something to stop it. But on the other hand, it should be simple. The Fire Nation was evil. The Firebender was probably evil. If this guy got out, he could immediately tell all the evil bloodies, and they would attack. There were dozens of kids here, living in tree houses in the woods because there was nowhere else to go. They didn't deserve to lose their home to the Fire Nation. Again. Plus, training to effectively fight firebenders was a good thing. And if the way they took out that camp was any indication, it was working. They'd been in the camp for 3 days now, but he hadn't gotten any further than the 2 circular thoughts. It was like when he threw boomerang. His thoughts would go one way for a moment, and then they would come right back around the other way, over and over again. He hadn't told his sister, or Aang yet, though he'd done some work to get Jet's cronies to think he did. Like a little, "Hey Katara, wouldn't it be cool if you could practice your bending against real firebenders? You know, just to practice," in front of Pipsqueak. She had, of course, answered, "I guess, but there's no way a firebender will willingly teach me to fight against them." And Sokka had to change the conversation before he could blurt out the whole willing part might not be a factor. He also sprinkled in some, "Hey Aang, do you want to see if anyone wants to spar? Or I guess it won't do much to prepare you to fight the Fire Nation," when Jet was nearby. Aang had predictably given Sokka a lecture about how violence was wrong for a good 15 minutes, which he endured only to rub it in Jet's face that convincing them wouldn't be as easy as the Earth Kingdom team wanted it to be. Not that he necessarily wanted to convince them. Not that he necessarily didn't. Boomerang thoughts. Sokka figured he'd earned himself a few days' peace with that display, but it would help if he had known what to do during these days. Sure, Katara was having a good time drooling after Jet, and Aang was living his best life playing in the woods, but he was no closer to knowing what he wanted to do. The teen turned his back to the target tree and threw the boomerang in the opposite direction. It had just left his hand when a familiar, obnoxious voice called out in greeting. "Hey!" Sokka turned to see Jet, suavely leaning against his tree, wheat in mouth. The teen smirked. "Looks like you missed." "Get down!" Sokka shrieked, his voice reaching decimals he wouldn't have thought Katara could hit. "Get down, get down, get down!" he called as the weapon curved around. Surprised, Jet dropped to the forest floor, mere seconds before Boomerang hit the bullseye once more, directly where Jet had been. Sokka breathed out a sigh of relief and scrambled over to help the now no longer suave-looking boy to his feet. Jet looked at the blade embedded in the tree, seemingly truly impressed for the first time they had met. Or, well, the first time he was impressed with Sokka. The Benders impressed him plenty. Sorry about that, but come on, really? Why would you stand in front of a tree full of scratches? Sokka gulped as he pulled Jet to his feet. Sorry, didn't realize what that thing could do. You're good with it. Well, you know me. I'm the boomerang guy. Sokka laughed nervously. He hated when Jet complimented him. Jet pulled the weapon from the tree and offered it to Sokka, who silently slid it back into his holster. Sokka cleared his throat. So, did you follow me out here for a boomerang lesson or some... Are you offering? Do you have access to boomerangs? They're pretty hard to make. One of my tribe's elders made this one. He's teaching me, but I still haven't gotten the balance right when a magical boy popped out of an iceberg and started dragging him and his sister around the world for adventures, near-death experiences, and moral conundrums. Jet shook his head. Then maybe not. I'm actually wanting to ask you a favor. A favor? Yeah, I see what you mean about Katara and Aang being hard to convince. Since we have to wait, I want to start going ahead on some other plans I have in the works. This is, I'd rather have my whole team of freedom fighters with me. Would you be willing to take a few shifts to watch the firebender? Sokka gaped widely, unseemingly. He knew he looked like an elephant koi, but he didn't seem to stop. You want me to... You trust me with that? I told you, Sokka. I think we understand each other. I think we're similar. Maybe some time with the firebender is exactly what you need to figure out how to talk to your friends. Yeah, maybe. Or maybe it was just make his moral horridry worse. Or it could actually solve everything. If the firebender was a totally evil, sending a dozen soldiers to fight a bunch of orphans, lying, honorless, Fire Nation piece of scum, then poof! All of his indecision would be gone. It was perfect. Okay, yeah, that's a great idea, Jet. I'll do it. Great. The older teen smiled, the wheat stalk rising into the air. You can take your shift tomorrow morning. I'll take you myself, give you the lay of the land. It's pretty simple, though, just sitting in a cave bringing him his meals. Sokka nodded. Okay, it was time for make a plan. You could do this.